Hi everyone, my name is Patrick. I'm an engineer at Microsoft. I work on the Edge team on developer tools. And what that means is I work mostly on Chromium. As you know, Edge has been rebuilt on top of the Chromium open source project a few years ago, and a lot of the contributions that we make in Edge are actually going up to the Chromium repository. Today I want to talk to you about a collaboration project that we did together with the Google folks working on Chrome DevTools. And specifically I want to talk to you about the Flexbox and grid tooling in Chromium that we added last year. Regarding logistics, I am unfortunately re-recording this session because I cannot make it to the talk, but my colleague Rachel is here on the call and she can answer any questions that you might have. So let's get started. The first part of the talk, I want to talk to you about why we worked on these tools. There are really three reasons for us to do that. One, Flexbox and CSS grid are very popular layout techniques used by web developers out there. Second, they're actually really complicated and a lot of people get tripped by them. And third, there was some prior art specifically done by Firefox that web developers out there were asking us to do as well. So those are the three reasons, and I'm going to dig deeper into them right now. In terms of popularity, Flexbox is really widely popular right now. If you look at chromeStatus.com, 75% of all page loads use Flexbox at least once, and it is growing. It is not. It has always been growing, and it's not slowing down. Grid, on the other hand, is much lower usage. It's only 10% right now, but at the same time it's growing as well. It's actually been doubling since last year, and I think from the year before as well. The other thing about Grid is that whenever it came out at the end of 2016 or beginning of 2017, all of the browser vendors had support for it at the same time. So that means that it was, unlike a lot of other features, actually support was great across the board from the very start. The other aspect in terms of popularity is if you look at the survey called the State of CSS, which is a survey that's been running for 3 years, I believe. So the one that's been done in 2020 came back with results that also indicate that Flexbox and CSS Grid are very popular. In fact, all of the participants said that they had used Flexbox. So all of them, 100%, and 75% of them said that they had used CSS Grid as well. If you compare that to the year before, it was only 50% who had used CSS Grid. So I believe that these layout techniques are today inevitable for web developers today. They are either using them already or they've heard of it and seen it and maybe had to debug it. At the same time, a few years back there wasn't any tools at all for any of them, which is a bit surprising for something that's so popular and used throughout. But at the same time you might wonder, why would we have tools for them? It's not like they're really bugs. And so that's the second reason of why we did that. It's not like you really have bugs with those techniques when you use Flexbox and CSS Grid, but it's more like with anything else in CSS, because you don't tell the browser how to do something, you only tell it what to do, because of the declarative nature of CSS, there's a lot of room for errors. Especially with CSS Grid and Flexbox, there are a tiny number of properties that actually can lead to many different results. And so that means that you need to know those properties very well and how they interact together and how you can combine them. And so a tiny mistake in there may lead to something completely unexpected. And so a lot of people have actually been confused by the syntax and they don't really remember how to achieve a particular layout, and that's why they've been asking for tooling to help with that. And the third reason, which I mentioned before related to Firefox, is at the end of 2016 Firefox released their first grid inspector tool. They innovated in that field, and then later they also worked on Flexbox tooling, and those tools became very popular among people working with CSS. And they became like the go-to tool for anybody doing serious CSS layout work, and people started asking other browser vendors to implement similar tools as well. So that's why those three reasons are why we worked on them. So early in 2020, we formed a cross-company virtual team of designers, PMs, and engineers, of which I was part of, and we embarked on the CSS tooling project. And the first thing that we did was to work on CSS grid tooling, which was released in Chrome and Edge at the fall of 2020. And since then, we've also been working on Flexbox tooling. Interestingly, WebKit or Safari actually announced their grid inspector a couple of weeks ago, actually. And so today, because it's in Firefox, because we've done it in Chromium, and because Safari has it, web developers can, they can use CSS grid tooling across the board and Flexbox tooling in the major browsers as well. Alright, so now I want to tell you a little bit about what the tools actually do, and then after that I'll tell you a little bit about how we made them. So in fact, one thing that I'd suggest now is you can go and try them yourself. Since we've made those features a few months ago, they're already available in Chrome and Edge in the stable releases. You don't have to download a pre-release channel, and you don't have to flip any experiment. They're all available right now. So I highly suggest that you just go and try them out. Open DevTools and start inspecting a page that uses grid and Flexbox, and you should start seeing some interesting things. The first thing that we did, that we knew we had to do right away, was the overlay, what we call the overlay. And if you've ever opened DevTools once in your life, you already most surely know what an overlay is. If you've selected an element from the DOM or from the page, you've seen those colored boxes appear as you move your mouse over the page, and that's what we call the overlay. Now, in a typical flow layout where things are stacked from top to bottom and left to right, it's rather simple. The overlay only shows you the margin, padding, and border, and that's really all you need. But in the case of Flexbox and Grid, because with just a few CSS properties you can achieve some really complicated CSS positioning, it was a lot harder for people to understand why certain CSS rules were having, the effect that they were having on the page. And so we thought that we needed to have more in the overlay. Just showing the margin, border, and padding was not really enough, and in that case we needed to show a lot more. In the case of Grid, for example, the grid is really interesting because you define a grid in CSS, but that grid does not exist anywhere else than in the CSS rules that you define. It's not like you can look at the HTML code and understand where there will be rows and columns that simply don't exist. And so one thing we knew we needed to do was to create an overlay that would actually display that grid on the page so that suddenly everything becomes clear. Just seeing the grid helps people debug problems a lot faster, a lot easier, because otherwise you're left wondering whether you've not defined the grid correctly or you've not positioned an item correctly. For Flexbox, it was interesting to show things like the flex lines or the gaps between items and things like that. And so one thing we did is that we made those overlays persistent as well as an option. Normally an overlay in DevTools is very transient, so you move your mouse and it appears, and as soon as you let go, it disappears. But with Flexbox and Grid, because there's more debugging involved, we made them persistent so that you can toggle them on and they'll stick around on the page, and then you can go and do other things while the overlay is still visible. In fact, one thing that we added in Chromium that Firefox, for example, does not have is we added a way to also see the effect of specific CSS properties on the page using the overlay. So normally the overlay is going to show you all of the grid rows, for example, and all the gaps and everything at once. But we also thought that because people are confused about what certain CSS properties do, it'd be good to show just what one of them does at a time. So for example, in Chromium, you can hover over a justify content property in CSS, which works in Flex and Grid, for example, and you will see only the effect of that property is having on the page. You'll see only that part being highlighted, and you will be able to make a parallel between here is a complex looking CSS property and here's what it does in the page. Another thing we added, an important piece that we added in Chromium as well, is called the layout panel. It is a new panel in the DevTools UI, just like any of the other panels, except this one acts as a central place for anything that you find interesting related to grid and Flexbox. So right now you'll see all of the grid layouts and all of the Flex layouts that are listed there, which is super useful when you use those types of layouts to organize your page, so you don't have to look for those nodes across the elements tree over and over again. You know they're there listed and you can select them quickly, and you can also use that panel to configure the way that the overlays look on the page. We also added, related to these, what we call badges in the elements panel. So over on the left, where all of the nodes from the DOM tree are listed, we now have those little bubbles that appear next to any element that is a Flex container or a grid container, and that's really useful. In a way, this is interesting because those badges, even though they look really simple, I think they are starting to turn the DOM tree in DevTools into something a little more interesting. It used to be that it's just a representation of the tree, but now with those badges, it looks a little bit more like a navigation tool through the layout. And it makes me think that there's a lot of ideas to be had where we could make this tool more interesting to Blink developers as well, and almost try to show the render tree. So as an alternative, so that you'd have both the DOM tree as well as the render tree, and you'd be able to see what DOM nodes and CSS led to, what render boxes were created because of that. And finally, another feature that we added, for now only for Flexbox, is a way to much more visually create or work on the Flexbox properties. The reason we did it only for Flexbox, at least at first, because we're planning on doing it for grid as well, is that people have been telling us over and over again that the Flexbox properties are really complicated. They never remember what direction justify content is in, align items, align content, which one to use, when, etc. So we thought, okay, those properties, the names of those properties don't make sense to them. And so if we create something visual where you don't immediately see in which direction those properties act on and what effect they're going to have on a particular element. So we created this Flexbox editor, which is, you click on it, you have a pop-up, and it gives you all of the different options that you can tweak for your CSS Flexbox layout. And we did something similar in the autocomplete as well. So even if you do want to write the CSS yourself, even if you do know the property names, you still have the nice visual aid that's very helpful, to avoid making mistakes and just to be more confident about your coding. So as I said, we are also planning on doing this for grid. And so that's it. Those are the features that we added for Chromium, Flex and grid tooling. And now I'd like to spend the last part of that presentation talking a bit about how we did that, a bit about the behind the scenes, basically. Okay, so now let's dive a little bit deeper into the behind the scenes of how we made those tools. First of all, I think the important aspect there is the collaboration between Google and Microsoft, which was really productive. We created a team that's cross companies, obviously, but we also created a team that's cross teams inside of Google and inside of Microsoft, because we consulted pretty heavily with the layout people working on the Blink layout engine. The core team was really DevTools experts. We know about the front end of DevTools and how to connect to the back end, but we didn't know as much when it comes to the Blink layout engine, and so we consulted with them quite a lot, and we asked a lot of questions, and they shared a lot of knowledge about how best to retrieve the information that we needed to expose these Flexbox and grid specific information. In fact, we're going further at the moment. We're trying to work with them even deeper on a better API to surface this information from Blink to DevTools. So let me talk about the overlay for a little bit, because the overlay is really the heart of that of the tool. And in order to do an overlay that knows where the grid tracks are and knows where the distributed space is between flex lines, for example, you really need that internal Blink knowledge. DevTools is a separate entity to the browser. In fact, it is just like a web app. If you've never done that before, you can actually debug DevTools from DevTools, because DevTools only uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the front end. So if you open DevTools in a separate window and then you press again Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I, you'll open a second DevTools window that targets the first one. And that's always fun to do, just to play around and change colors around and things like that. But all of that to say that DevTools itself doesn't know anything about the grid. In fact, it doesn't even have access to the DOM element. The only way that it can do that is by using CDP, the Chrome DevTools protocol. So it sends a request to the backend. And the backend in that case is actually DevTools code as well, but in C++, which runs in the renderer process of the page. And so from that, it has access to things like DOM elements, and it can access some layout information, and that's how we do those, grid and Flexbox overlay. That's how we can know where things are and draw the right things. One thing that became quite clear, though, is that the layout engine, for performance reasons, is obviously very optimized, and as soon as it doesn't need a specific information around, it's not going to keep it around. So one very specific information that we needed was flex lines. In a Flexbox layout, when you have wrapping involved, you may have items that start wrapping into subsequent lines. You can control the space between those lines and whether they stack up or at the bottom or things like that. And you can control that in CSS, but the notion of flex lines does not exist anymore in a way that DevTools could access it. So we had to recreate that information in order to show it in the Flexbox overlay on the page. And so essentially that meant for DevTools code to redo a little bit what the Blink rendering engine was already doing. And so that's why we're working on a new set of APIs right now with the layout experts to expose that information from the engine directly instead of DevTools having to recreate it a little bit. So at a high level, what's an overlay? It's an interesting piece of the DevTools puzzle, so I thought it made sense to talk about it here. The way we draw the overlay is by using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like for the rest of the DevTools UI. Except that it's a little bit special. Because it is on top of the page, it has to be positioned there. It is not part of the DevTools UI, it's separate. It also does not live in the page directly, because we do not want that special content to impact the page. You shouldn't, as a web developer, you shouldn't be able to get the element from the DOM that are used to draw the margin padding and whatnot. So the way that this works is that it's a special page that gets created in Blink. It's a special layer on top of the page. It has a transparent background. It is exactly the same size as the rest, as the content page, and it is, just stacked on top of it. One interesting aspect of that is that it actually is driven by the rendering loop of the content page. So as soon as the content page gets repainted, that triggers a refresh of the overlay special layer page. And so that means that, for example, if we're highlighting an element in a content page that is rotated, like with a CSS animation, for example, we do not have to repaint the overlay ourselves. That's taken care of automatically by the system that's in place. And so in terms of the flow of things, we start in the DevTools front end. That sends a CDP command saying, hey, please, can you highlight that element in the page with the grid overlay, for example. That CDP request is going to reach the DevTools backend, running in the renderer process, written in C++. That backend is going to create the special layer on top of the page if it hasn't been created before, and it's going to load some special HTML content in there, which essentially is just a script tag to load some JavaScript files. And that JavaScript file is going to be the one responsible ultimately for drawing the shapes In the meantime, the C++ backend of DevTools is going to gather all of the information that it needs from the layout engine, for example, the number of grid rows and columns and how big they are, bundle that into a JSON formatted object, send that over to the script tag in the special layer page, and then that JavaScript file that's running there is going to receive it and use that information to draw whatever shapes it needs to draw. In the case of Flexbox and Grid, we decided to use Canvas to draw those shapes because of the nature of the things we needed to draw, it just made perfect sense to use Canvas there. And that's it. That's a little bit about the behind the scenes of how we did that. That's also it for this talk. I hope you liked it. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat. And I'd be super happy if you could try the tools as well. So thanks.